Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here today. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here after some time and see the new campus, see some familiar faces and meet some new people and hear about the exciting things going on. So today I would like to talk to you a little bit about research we've done on interactive display systems. And interactive display is sort of an application that brings together a lot of capabilities in computer vision. So let me start very basically, since it's a broad audience, to try to give a sense of what's computer vision in terms of how does it separate itself from graphics and image processing. Most of us in electrical engineering have maybe image processing background, and we can think of that as working with pixels and ending up with pixels. So you may do restoration or enhancement or compression. You start with an image, you finish with an image. In computer vision, we do a lot of work in terms of taking pixels and extracting some description information. So we go from pixels to words, whereas in graphics, you start with a story, maybe a word, a few words, a description, and then you generate the pixels. So my research started in image processing and then has moved towards computer vision, and the two are intricately related. But as we get more and more capabilities in terms of computing and mobility, we start to look at things that are intelligent, and that means they can do some high-level reasoning based on the information we can extract out of a scene. They have a lot of applications in the real world. They are real-time, so it has minimal delay, which allows the user to interact with the environment. And that can lead to some interesting research in terms of optimization, both in terms of algorithms and software, and also the development of some specialized hardware. And everything is getting mobile, connected, distributed. And when you get in that mode, you have a lot of opportunity for collaboration, but also some new problems, like how do you work with resource constraint systems, because you don't want your battery to kind of run out immediately. From a high level, we can think of computer vision as having two major steps. One is the feature extraction step, where we distill as much information as we can out of the initial set of data through feature extraction. And then with those features, then we do a classification second step, where we can actually extract some meaning out of what's going on. And you're probably familiar with a lot of those classification techniques that are pretty typically used. Nearest neighbors or neural networks, support vector machines, and of course, statistical pattern recognition. For those of you that may not have seen support vector machines, for example, or SVMs, we see there that, let's say we have two classes of data, the green and the red, and the SVM will do just binary classification. So we try to find the separating hyperplane, something in between, that will give the maximum margin. In this case, the margin is kind of the distance between what are the support vectors that define the interfaces of those two class distributions. Okay, that's just an example. And there's a lot of work going in classification research, feature extraction research, as well as systems that use those kinds of methods. So let's talk a little bit about interactive displays, work that has been taking place in our lab. Let's say you have a smart space, and that can be your monitor. Maybe it can track some of the things you're doing and react accordingly. Or it can be a surveillance system on the street that finds faces and maybe some of the activities that take place. Or it can be something like a window display. When you stop to look at it, it starts figuring out what is it you're interested in. Is it a particular product, or is it something else? And then you can adjust its content based on your preference. Maybe you can even detect if you are a male or female, or you may detect your age group and how you're dressed based on your hipness factor, right? A lot of different things. And then it will give you different suggestions. Now, it can also be big in gaming, as you might imagine, right? Can we do gaming without using a controller? And last summer, Microsoft came out with a project called Project Natal for Xbox. And it's kind of interesting. Have any of you seen this YouTube video by any chance? So it may be interesting just to see this video, just to give you a sense of some of the capabilities that Microsoft envisions for gaming. And of course, they're very much related to a interactive display environment. So let's say you have an interactive display. Here the motto is no controller required. So you walk through your house, the display recognizes you, maybe it challenges you to a game. You decide, okay, I'll take you on. And of course, you start fighting. So after a while, you learn some good moves. You can knock out your opponent, and you don't get hurt in either way. Or you may want to play a different game. Maybe you want to play a little bit of a racing game, if you're a NASCAR fan or a Formula fan. And as you can see, again, it's all based on your movement. It's pretty easy so far. You can envision, okay, if you move one way or the other, it's good. But then if you start to change the tires or do some other more intricate things, you can see how gesture recognition becomes even more important, right? There are some other things maybe you can do. Perhaps you can assume a character like a monster. And the system recognizes not only your movement, your activity, it may also recognize your expression. So if you do a given expression, maybe you can get some fire coming out. Or maybe you will do other things like aerobics or skateboarding or a bunch of other applications that will get you off the couch, right? So when we saw this video, we got a little depressed, right? Because we figured Microsoft has solved all these problems we're working on. But it turns out that nothing is completely solved, even if you think it is, because there's always a new angle and a new opportunity. But in this case, I've been asking people, have you used this system? Have you used this system? Just to see how well does it really work in practice. And maybe it doesn't work as well as this video would suggest. But it's still a great video because it gives you a lot of motivation on doing this kind of research. So here are some of the things that we've been looking at in our lab. Face detection, face recognition, pose estimation, expression recognition, activity recognition, as well as gesture and tracking. And I will touch on some of these topics today, and I'll be happy to discuss further afterwards. So let's start with pose estimation. So there are three ways we can, 3 degrees of freedom when we look at head movement. Yaw left to right motion is pretty typical when we talk about pose. There's also the up and down motion, the pitch, and there's the roll. But the roll is the easiest one because it's really a rotation problem. So it's pretty easy to fix or detect. So in general, the approach we're taking to finding yaw and pitch is to locate the face and extract some features, and from there develop some descriptors that will do a good job in estimating pose. So the face detection is a well-known problem. Typically, you would solve it by scanning different regions of the image and trying to do some operations to detect the face. Okay, so maybe you have a window of a given size, it goes through. You have a different size window, it goes through. And eventually, you detect all the face in the picture. There are a lot of methods to do face detection. Okay, you can detect all these different kinds of faces and maybe crop the region. A very typical way is to use a cascade of features, otherwise known as Viola-Jones, where you have these simple detectors that here, let's say, they will detect the eye pattern. And if those detectors get through, then that means there is still something going on in that area. We keep it as a candidate. If they don't detect anything, we just ignore that region. And then you go through these different cascades. And you narrow down your options until at the end you end up with the faces. Once we get the face, though, we want to do further analysis, maybe found the eyes and mouth. And we can detect those with tuned classifiers. If we start with kind of a standard anthropometric measurements, we can kind of say, okay, if it's the face, then the eye should be around in that region. So we don't have to search the whole space. We just search that region, and let's say we do a support vector machine classifier for eye, non-eye, and we detect left eye, we detect right eye. And once we have the eyes, we can do the same thing, same approach for mouth. Now, we looked at just having these 3 points on the face, right? We have a triangle. As the pose changes, so do the angles on that triangle. And it's pretty easy doing some trig to figure out which way the person is looking. And it's fairly good method, but it does assume that you have these points located accurately. If you start making errors in your localization, you're going to start messing up your estimate. So we also looked at maybe some more robust ways of placing the points and using more of them so we get a better result. This one is an active shape model, and there are different types of active shape models that can be placed on a given face, and they will give you a pretty good estimate of where different features are located. So the way we do the active shape model is we start with the original, find the face like we talked about, find the eyes, and do a loose placement based on the eyes of this shape model, and then start fine-tuning it, working along the gradients. And you keep doing that a couple of times, you have pretty good localization. And now we want to start training for different cases of pose. Okay. Now, in computer vision, part of the challenge is finding good data sets. Okay, and finding a good data set that's nicely marked and you can use for training is not always easy. In this case, we found a data set that seemed to work pretty well. As you can see, it has 7 positions for yaw and 3 positions for pitch. And for each of those positions, we developed an active shape model. And from those, then, we tried to find predictors that were geometric, which was very easy to compute. Here's an example of a predictor, left eye area of a right eye area. You do that, and you can see that you get a surface that varies with yaw, because it just changes slope as the yaw changes, but does not vary with pitch. So we can do pitch-independent detection of yaw using this predictor. This is approximately how the different face poses correspond on that surface. So this is just one. We can do that for a few. We can do for eyebrow areas and mouth lengths and eye centers and so forth. Some of them work better than others, as you can tell. If it was a perfect predictor, you just get a straight line. So these don't work at all. So we throw those out. The ones that work pretty well, we can do a regression model and get a pretty good result. We also wondered how this result would generalize to other databases. So here you can see the mean error is very small, less than 2 degrees, which was really, really good for something that's passive, right? We don't use any infrared or anything like that. So we did try it on a different database, and we got about 3 degrees of average error, which is still fairly good. So we were happy with that. Okay, we can get the pose then. You can get the same thing for pitch, right? Similar approach, just different descriptors. These are all geometric, very easy to compute, very fast, very suitable for a real-time environment. So now we can get the pose. Here are some examples. You can see the phases and where the eyes are located, where the pose is detected. We did not detect a bird, okay? We just do human face detectors. Here's another example. The arrows are not all perfect, but the general direction is decent. And we have pose, so then when you go up to a display, you can kind of look at different locations, and we can tell where the person is looking. Another topic has to do with activity recognition. And in this case, the recognition that we did was based on some shape models, particularly using the shape context. So I'm sure you're familiar with activity recognition. It's very useful in surveillance systems. It's also useful for things like entertainment or safety, health monitoring, all kinds of things. And there are a few ways to actually do that. You can use the silhouette, you can use stick figures, you can do volumes in terms of temporal variation of features. And we decided to look at shape because shape is very revealing. And you can do it very quickly in one frame, right? So there are some standard sets with activities. This one has activities like walk, run, jump, skip, bend, shuffle, jump in place, wave one hand or two hands. And you can see just by looking at those silhouettes, just one frame, you can kind of tell which activity people are doing. So we thought that would be a good way to start. We do background subtraction to get the silhouette. And the shape context is a descriptor that looks at the silhouette points. You can get as many points as you want around the silhouette. And in our case, the fewer the better, because we try to do processing fast. Typically, people may use 400 points. We just used 50 points. And it seemed to work well for our purposes. And then you get a two-dimensional histogram representation that you get by placing a logarithmic ring wedge kind of grid on top of the point you're considering, and then seeing how many points populate different bins, and then you create one line for this one placement. You go to the next point, you do the same thing, you create the second line, you go to the next one, the next line, and so forth. So you have this shape context descriptor, and then if you have a database of known shapes for different activities, you can go in your database and match. And the way to match can be any kind of distance metric. In this case, we use the chi-square distance. Now that works well, but of course, as you can imagine, there are some situations where similar shapes will result from different activities. So in this case, you have jumping and bending. They look approximately the same. Or you may have walking and running approximately the same, and so forth. So you want to let it evolve over time. Or you might incorporate some motion with every point. So for example, if this person is walking, their motion pattern will be different than if someone with a similar contour is actually running. So we can do some motion, let's say for this estimation for this point, we would look at the region around the point because they're only moving so fast, and do a search in that, locate the point that gives you the best match, and then obtain the motion vector. So now with every point, we have not only shape information, we also have a velocity information. And with that, we can much more easily discriminate. So we could expand the concept of shape context to include motion. In this case, then you can see, okay, what's the difference between this one and this one? There's a lot more motion on the hand, so this is probably jumping jacks. This is probably just two-hand wave. Similarly, between this one and that one, there is a lot more motion here compared to that, even though their shape is similar. So this probably run, this probably walking. Okay, so you can see how motion can help you. Now I want to give you a little bit of a sampling on how these activities actually look. So you can tell for yourselves what they are. So you can see the two-hand wave there, jumping jacks. That one is the skipping, which is kind of the shuffling, which is kind of hard to detect. It's between jumping and this is jumping in place, one-hand wave, and so forth, okay? So you see a lot of skipping and all that. Oops. Okay. So here's what we did. We extracted the shape context for a given frame. And we also collected the sequence of frames. For each one, we take the shape context and try to match it with our database. So this database will collect information from all the activities, and then based on nearest neighbor, we can associate this unknown frame with a known activity. If we have a video sequence, we can do that for each and every frame in the video sequence. And most of the frames are correctly identified. Some may be misclassified if they are somewhere in between. And then through a majority vote, we can actually get the activity fairly well. So in general, the 2D shape context gave 86% recognition for frame by frame, or 96.8 for the whole video sequence, and the motion raised that to 90% and 97.8. So overall, pretty good. These are some of the examples where the motion helped. You can see here, this is a two-hand wave, not jumping jack, so it was able to discriminate that. Similarly with walking and running, and so forth. These are some activities for individual results. I'll concentrate on the full video. All the videos were correctly identified except for skip. That was the only one that was misclassified. And the times that it was misclassified is because it was confused with run or jump forward. Okay? Now, if you go back to the interactive display, when you get the pose information, the face localization, maybe you also want to know how the person enjoys what they're seeing. Are they smiling or frowning? So looking at expression recognition is another area that we have interest in. In this case, we use shape context to also find expression, as we did with activity. Again, finding the right data is very important. This is an example of a CMU database, just to give you a sense. These are videos evolving over time: happy, sad, angry, and surprised. Okay, all right. Again, if I gave you just the first frame, you couldn't tell what they are. So we have to pick the right timing in order to identify the expression. And we also did an approach which was sort of by parts. So if you extract the shapes, we just extracted the shapes of the eye and eyebrow as well as the mouth. And based on this information alone, we try to see how far can we go in identifying the expression, because these are some of the critical components in how people do expressions. Okay, so again, the shape context, we talked about that. And then for each of those, we would actually make a decision. Does this correspond to a happy person or angry person and so forth? Get that expression and then integrate all of that through a neural network. And you can integrate that through a lot of different means: neural network, Bayesian network, a different type of classifier. For the purpose of these experiments, we use the neural network, but there's nothing to prevent you from using other things. And it seemed to do fairly well. This is a frame-by-frame recognition once the activity has started to develop. And this is the full video result for this small database, only 18 subjects. So that seemed promising. And now we're exploring some other methods for activity recognition. I'll get to those in just a couple of minutes. Now, this was kind of the initial part of the talk more about shapes, but a new area that we're looking in has to do with dimensionality reduction, and there are some exciting developments in that area. I'm pretty sure you're fairly familiar with principal component analysis. That's been around for a while. But there are some other things like manifold learning and random projections that are becoming fairly popular, and they seem to be very powerful tools. Now, why can't we just stick with principal components? Why do we have to go out to other things? One thing with principal components, we have to know something about the statistics of the data we're dealing with. And if we don't have a good representation of that, we're going to get in trouble, right? So if we do faces and then we go into a different object, it's going to be a problem. Now, the nice thing about dimensionality reduction is that it's computational efficient because it reduces the number of dimensions in the space we're operating on. So if you think of going from image space to feature space, we can reduce that by doing just a dimensionality reduction step. And it gives you a nice, elegant representation and pretty good performance. Now, for those of you that may not be familiar with principal component analysis, I'm going to just give a quick example on how it can be used in the context of face recognition. In this case, we have a face identification problem. The idea here is, let's suppose someone comes up to you and shows you their ID, tells you, I'm really 21, and you check the picture on their ID and their face. You have to do some comparison, right? You know, that's kind of a face identification problem. Can you compare the individual with something in a database and see how close does it come to match? We used a multi-camera system for that, where one camera looks at kind of the whole view, identifies the faces, identifies the dominant face, and then the second camera kind of zooms into that to actually get a good location of the facial features. Once we do that, we look for a point where the person is kind of looking forward. And if they're just looking at frontal, we can work with eigenfaces, which is kind of the space where people do principal components based on Turk and Pentland work a few years back. So here, to develop the eigenfaces, which are really the eigenvectors in phase space, that's all they are. You start with an average phase. If you get enough samples, this looks neither male nor female, right? Because you want to average everything out. And then you start looking at the first components. The first few are going to be very broad, a little ghostly looking. And you see it will have some illumination effects, like left to right, top to bottom. And after that, you'll keep adding more and more features. If you keep adding and adding, you'll get maybe some situation where you're just adding minute details. You don't need those anymore. You can throw that out. And keep just the first few ones that capture all the essential information. So it's very nice, very powerful. And you can match the coefficients of those faces with whatever is in your database and see if those two sets of coefficients match close enough. Then it's a good match. If they don't, then it's a bad match. And this is how the system looked. Found the person, identified the features, aligned them, did the processing, and found the match. Now, why they have to be perfectly aligned is because if you're not aligned, if you have rotated your head or slightly to the side, this is not going to work anymore, okay? Because the coefficients will be different, and the match will not be as good as it should be. So one of the limitations in general of this approach is that everything has to be frontal. And if it's not frontal, it doesn't work. If you go to side pose, you have to develop a new classifier, a new set of eigenfaces for that pose. And if you go to profile, yet another one. So that's kind of a thing that keeps bugging you every time you do vision, because it keeps coming back as you being constrained from a view. Another thing we have done is random projections, and we've used that for face detection and tracking. Now, random projections we can think of as a dimensionality reduction technique. It's related to a method, to a new field called compressed sensing. You may have heard of that, right? And random projections, they're nice in terms of they're linear, they're data independent, and they're very efficient. So the linear part is nice, but the data independent part is even nicer, right? Because now you don't depend on a given object. You don't need to know anything about its statistics. You can just transform and do all your processing in random projection space. So random projections are based on something called Johnson-Lilienstraun's lemma. The idea here is if you start with a high dimensional space, you can find a random matrix that will reduce the dimensionality once we do the matrix operation. So we go from m dimensions down to k. And you can still preserve the pairwise distance between points. That's the key element here. And that pairwise distance can be within some epsilon, right? Depending on how much you're willing to throw out. That will determine how big this epsilon is. But the nice thing of this pairwise distance preservation is that since a lot of the classification methods just care about distance, if we preserve the distance in this new space, our classifiers still work. Okay, so that observation is what kind of makes it very powerful, because now we're in a new space. It has much lower dimensionality, and it works just as well. Okay. The other thing is we're not constrained to a single random projection matrix. We can do a lot of different ones. The ones that suit our purpose, we can select. For example, we can just have independent, identically distributed Gaussian samples. That's fine. But then we have a full matrix to compute, and we don't have simple operations. We need multiplications. We can also come up with a matrix that has just 1 or -1. And 2/3 of the time it has 0, which is really nice, right? Because 2/3 of the time we don't have to do anything. And the other third, we just have to do addition or subtraction, no multiplication. So that computes really, really fast. And it's very computationally efficient. And now let's say we go to random projection space. We train our classifier. In this case, it's a support vector machine. It works just as well as PCA. We did the test. If you reduce the dimensions, let's say, to 20%, it still works fairly well, right? And then it asymptotes. So you can cut down your computation time, your space dimensionality, and still do pretty well. The same thing we can do with tracking. We can do tracking in random projection space, right? You can do tracking in just phase space or image space, but you can do it in random projection space, and that will save you some computational cost. But besides that, we also want tracking to be pose independent as you turn around, don't lose tracking, illumination independent, and camera independent. So for that, we implemented a dynamic template tracking technique. So we go into a random projection space, and then we start building a template library. Every time we do a detection, let's say a face detection, and comes out positive, then we know we have a face. We put it in our dictionary. After that, we have a piece of the dictionary that's transient. So we can include faces and update them as the person moves around. And if we do another face detection, after a while, it may be a different pose. We also put that in the static part of the dictionary. And then we keep updating with transient templates. So if you have transient templates, you can kind of track things when they change pose or get slightly occluded and things like that. If they get completely occluded, you will get something different. So then that will not give you a good match. You don't include that in your dictionary. Okay, so these are some examples how we were able to track at different poses. I'm going to play a sequence for you to see. Here's Tony. He moves around. He starts changing his pose. He's still being tracked fairly well. Okay. Now, what happens if the illumination changes? You go from very dark to pretty bright. Can we still detect? Here is Tony again in a dark room. I hope you can see back there. You can kind of see the backs. He moves around. He's still being tracked. He starts to turn around. There's a little bit of a loss, but then once you run the detector, you can pick him up again. His friend changes the lighting. Should come up any minute. So it's pretty dark now, right? And then finally, hopefully the lights will come on. There it is. And things are working fine. Okay, so that would have application if you work in a street. You go from sunlight to a shade because of a building, and you can still track pretty well. And then if you have some variations in zoom or occlusion, this will also work. This is all done, again, in random projection space. It's fairly fast, and it's with this template dictionary updating. So here we have an occlusion with the hand. It didn't track the hand. Now, if you had a histogram-based method, you may track the hand, right, if you're basing it on histogram. He takes off his glasses, a little bit of a variation in appearance. Still works pretty well. Okay. And now the last piece I wanted to say is we're also looking at manifold learning. It's a dimensionality reduction technique, but it gives you a lot more than that, in that it's a nice way to represent deformations in objects. As we said, when someone changes their pose, things start to fall apart. And we looked at manifold learning as being a way to actually get around this problem, to do a detector for view-independent pose, okay? Now, what is manifold? We can think of a manifold as a topological space. It's locally homomorphic to Rk, and that's a k-dimensional manifold. And the idea is you have this low-dimensional manifold embedded in a high-dimensional space. And that's where you start your processing. That's maybe the phase space, right? So if you have a 50 by 50 area representing a phase, you have 2,500 dimensions here. You want to reduce that to maybe 5 dimensions or 20 dimensions and still be able to represent the object fairly well at different poses, okay? Now, the trick here is how do you actually get this mapping? How do you get this construction of the manifold? And that's what manifold learning is all about. These are some typical manifold shapes, right? They are all nice and smooth, okay? So let's say if you are here, you're looking frontal, and if you move down this direction, you turn on one side, and you move to the other direction, you turn on the other side. Or maybe this is your neutral face expression. As you move here, you get happy. You move here, you get sad. So you get the idea of how different points on the manifold can represent deformations of the same object. So if we were able to do this manifold learning and get that, it would be really good. And these are all graph embedding approaches. Some of the standard ones is the isomap. That's more of a global approach. Local linear embedding, that's more of a local approach, or locally preserving projections and so forth. And we've tried a few of them. Now, they're all nice, and I'm going to show you some results. This is how the face pose would change. This is being the neutral pose, and this moving on one side, this moving on the other side. Okay. Also, for different poses, can we do detection? Okay, this is a database that has different poses. We use the locally linear embedding to actually map on a manifold, and we got a 97% correct detection, even though they were at different poses. For pose estimation, this kind of shows you how things change. We have let's see, the red being 45 degrees and the black being minus 45, and then we go from different colors showing you the different poses. This is bringing it down to only 3 dimensions. That's very low dimensionality, and it still kind of gives you good results. If we do a different method, SLPP, separation gets a lot better. And you can kind of see how different faces correspond to different locations on your manifold. And by the way, for demonstration purposes, this is just 2 of the dimensions, right? Also, we can do manifold learning in random projection space, since we like both so much, right? So we start with random projections. We can reduce the space, and then within random projection space, do a manifold, and we use that for face recognition. And depending on how much you train, you can do fairly well. Compared, say, to PCA, if we do good training, PCA gives you 86%. We get 98% with this approach. So it really can give you a boost. Manifold learning is typically nonlinear, okay? And just getting the manifold is an active area of research, okay? So those of you that may be interested, there's a lot to do in this area. So I just wanted to conclude and allow a few minutes for questions, if there are any. We have used interactive display as kind of an application environment where a lot of different methods come together under the same umbrella. And this can be detection, recognition, pose, expression, gesture, and so forth. Along the way, we have found a couple of very interesting tools, random projections and manifold learning, that provide efficient representation and good result. I wanted to acknowledge the support of a few companies here for our lab, as well as the people who have been doing the heavy lifting of the work. A couple of PhD students, Greg and Ray, and some master students who have now graduated. And I want to thank you for being here. And I have some relevant references that I can send you if you have more interest. So thank you very much. We're creating an interactive display where people go up and we have a variety of pictures. When they look at the picture, it gets in the center. And if they smile, it gets bigger. And that's kind of a starting point. This is in collaboration with Kodak. They're interested in putting this system into museums so that when people look at something with interest, it can give them more information on the display. But I can see a lot of different applications. For example, you go to the mall, you look at a nice suit or a nice dress. It can tell you like it. It gives you some more information. Okay.
The one where you had the different lighting and you had the inclusion, was that running in real time? Can that run in real time?
It can run in real time. This is all MATLAB code, so it was not real time, the one I just showed. But on the system that we're running, we're doing a lot of different things, which is detection, tracking, the placement of the active shape model, and the expression. And we run about 5 frames a second with all that on a single machine. So it's not optimized code. It's just on a dual machine. Okay. Yeah.
So I guess my question is, what if the individual doesn't want to interact with the smart space? What I mean by that is, for a video game, for instance, I wanted to know what I'm doing, right? I'm looking to the left very deliberately because I wanted to know. But for an advertisement or something like that, if I want to look over there and not move my head because I don't want it to recognize me, or I don't know that it's trying to recognize me, or I'm wearing baggy clothing, or my clothes match the background, what happens then?
Yeah, a lot of things could happen. For example, I know of an application where they have a display in a bus station where people wait for the bus, and it can change its content depending on whether it's a man or a woman. Okay, what happens if the person has glasses and a baseball hat and their winter coat on? I guess I don't know. It depends what you decide. It should happen, and it's not going to be perfect. I mean, vision is not perfect, but what happens is with a lot of new things, we have new algorithms. We have a lot more processing power even on handhelds, and we have people having more and more awareness that these things exist. Then it's more likely to find good applications. Yes?
So I guess the fact that you're working with industry, how do you reconcile the fact that, well, I mean, those techniques are fine, but they're not nowhere near perfect. And so how do you reconcile that with an industry that basically wants everything to work 100% of the time?
Well, you just find the right people. And they realize that, okay, there are limitations, so then we have to put in the right context. Okay, an example has been the idea of medical imaging, right? You want a machine to do fully automatic detection, and then you never get that. So you can use it as pre-screening, because for some things you have high confidence, for some things you have low confidence. So you can do a pre-screening and say, okay, maybe 50, maybe 80% of what you're looking at, they don't have to also go through the doctor. And then this 20%, where's the gray area, it has to go through the doctor. Similarly, you can use computer vision in more creative ways like that.
It's a selective performance.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean.
And the other thing is, in terms of real time, some of those techniques are pretty heavy.
Yeah.
Heavy duty. Manifold learning, stuff that's.
I think the learning part is offline. Once you do the learning, to run it, you don't need to do the learning. All you need to do is the mapping, and that's a lot easier, because it's just a matrix multiplication. So if we can do the training ahead of time, which we do in most cases. There are some online methods that use it as you go, but in most cases you just do it ahead of time, and everything is set. So when you do the testing or the actual real-time use, it's a lot less computation. Was there another question? Yeah.
What are the hardware requirements for that? I mean, is it easily to port to like mobile applications? Is there really a lot of intensive CPU processing that you do to make that all happen?
It depends. Some are easier than others. And there are a few ways that you can get help. So if you do your work on a desktop, you can maybe use GPUs for acceleration. So by using the graphics unit as a coprocessor, you can accelerate a few orders of magnitude, depending on what you're doing, right? So, so we did a segmentation project with GPUs. We got 55x increase, still on a desktop, but with a GPU card dedicated to processing. And it doesn't work for every case, but in some cases it works better than others. Also, Google, in their new phone, has an application called Google Goggles. Has anybody used that? Yeah. So the idea there is you take a picture with your smartphone, and that will recognize some things about what it is you took a picture and give you more information. So you may go to the Eiffel Tower or the Statue of Liberty, take a picture, and it will give you some information about that landmark. You may take the picture of a painting. It will tell you this is Mona Lisa, this is the history behind it. You may take a picture of a book cover or a CD, and will give you information on maybe the rating and where you can buy it. But it doesn't do everything yet, right? So you're being selective to the things that it can do, and it does have GPS to help it. But it's not all on the cell phone. It has a connection to a cloud computing environment that has Google servers running all that stuff, and then it gives you back the result. Okay, so there are a lot of different ways to take advantage of computational capabilities through hardware or networking or optimization.
Okay, go ahead. I like the.
Thank you for your talk. It occurs to me that I'm young enough that the only significant interactive change to interacting with desktop computers, etc., has been this change from a mouse-based sort of interaction to a gesture and touch screens. And so that leads me to sort of this question of, since we're starting to interact with screens and displays in somewhat new ways, but really based on gesture and touch, do you see any really exciting paths to interact with more of the stuff that you've talked about that are somewhat more realistic and probable that we might see within the next 10 years?
Well, it's not all that far-fetched. I mean, I guess certainly you can do some things with your computer in terms of recognizing it's you to give you access. You know, there's a lot of that you can do now. It's just that it's not done. Okay, so the faces are the obvious ones. I see also a lot of potential with assistive technologies. People who are blind or deaf or have mobility problems. There are a lot of good ways to interact for these populations that are novel and give them access. And I know there's a project here in terms of interface for the blind. So that's very exciting work, definitely. And it opens a brand new field. Yeah. So I see a lot of promise personally. I think it's just very exciting.
A bit of a follow-up, but slightly off perhaps. What do you tell to the notion of eye movement tracking? Or a little closer to what you're doing. I have a colleague who's collaborating
Yeah.
on that social technical stuff, and she's trying to see how people interact with their virtual worlds or virtual environments.
Yeah, that's another big area. And there are two ways to do that. There is the active tracking, where you have an infrared system that looks at your eyeball, and it can do a fairly good job in localizing. We have a group at RIT who does that. And their challenge is to make this system really, really small and portable, because, you know, if you have to wear a helmet, it's not the same thing. I also see a lot in terms of little displays. Anything from being connected to your friend. Like we had a project where people would wear goggles and they would display things that their friend was seeing, you know, in a different part of campus through the Wi-Fi network. And so immediately you start kind of sharing your experiences in a lot of different ways. Back to the eye tracking, we've had some work done with eye tracking, but just from the camera perspective. And it's fairly challenging, I think, to get nice localization just from visual images, because of how fast the eyes move and how hard it is to actually get the pupil given illumination conditions. Like this lighting is horrible for eye tracking, right? Because it's all dark. And that's what our lab is like. So you can imagine you need a nice setup. So that's definitely a very good area, the eye tracking. Because, I mean, besides the pose, you want to know where the eye exactly is looking.
Because ultimately there's the other portion of it, which is not only your portion, which is to look at the angles and that, but it's also an issue of actually registering that with the content of the screen, which is of course beyond.
Exactly, exactly.
Which if it's moving, of course now it's become, it's relative, right? If you're looking, as you same, you and I can be looking at the same, and that's the motivation, that we can be collaborating in this virtual environment, and both of us are working on the same thing, but we have different angles, right? So even if you have physically the angle of where you're looking on the screen, it has also to be somehow now registered with what that screen is actually.
Yes, yes, that's, yeah.
Of the world.
Yeah.
Something to talk about.
Okay, definitely.
Let's send the speaker then in the interest of time.